My father passed away really young, and so we were a single parent family. My mom remarried quick. My stepfather wasn't like my dad at all. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. At 9 years old, I began to escape into drugs. And so it was a place I ran to for the next 15 years. There's 3 letters. A is action, the things that we do. I is the inspiration, or Simon Sinek calls the why, or the purpose or passion. And then R is the roadblock. The R dominated my life. Just before I got off the street, there was a guy named Gus. And I remember he looked at me and he said, "You know, Joe, there's more to you than you can see." And at the time, I was a dirty, disheveled street person. But he spoke to my potential, what was just sort of behind that. And Gus was right. I got a second chance. In less than 12 years, I was a celebrated entrepreneur. I'm incredibly independent. I live in the illusion of self-sufficiency. The heaviest thing I ever lifted in my life was my hand for help. But today, when I'm afraid or feeling hurt, I try to reach out. I had 10,000 people helping and supporting me because the R's were so big in my life. So when I'm talking to people who are really stuck in the ditch, it's to try and surround them with people who can be like Gus, encourage them. We are so extraordinary beyond anything in any label or any box we put ourselves in. We are love, we're light, we're beauty. And when we connect to that and let that shine through, that's when I think our most beautiful.
Greater Good Radio, connect, learn, heal, and grow, is brought to you by Brain Gain Hawaii, a boutique executive recruiting, career development, and coaching firm. Learn more at braingainhi.com. Welcome to Greater Good Radio. Joel Roberts, the Skid Row CEO. Thank you so much for spending the time with me today. I know you're busy, you have family things and business things, and I appreciate it.
I appreciate the invitation. Anywhere I can get an opportunity to leverage a platform to share a positive message. So I appreciate the work that you do, Evan, and thanks for your patience and accommodating.
So we initially, I didn't meet you, but I saw you at the Hawaii Business Magazine mental health conference that they did a few months ago. And your story was super inspirational, how you went through childhood trauma and then through your journey, your healing journey, and then to now. So for people who don't know about you, maybe could you introduce yourself a little bit and give kind of the highlights?
So the short version is sort of painfully common. I grew up in a lower middle class family north of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Dad that went to work, mom stayed at home. And unfortunately, my father passed away really young. And so we were a single parent family. My mom remarried quick. My stepfather wasn't like my dad at all. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic. So before the age of 9, I had the grief of losing my father, which we did not process properly. It was the early 70s. We didn't know about grief-informed trauma, or, we didn't understand those things. And then I had the ongoing physical, mental, and emotional abuse from my stepdad. So at 9 years old, I began to escape into drugs. And, when I think about the last 4 years, what I was going through was a real sense of insecurity. My world was a shifty place to live. It was a scary place to live. And I know that today, when human beings are dealing with uncertainty, things like inflation, divisiveness in politics, all these things that have happened, COVID, these things, they make us uneasy. And so we seek to change our emotional state. I used drugs for the first time at 9. And for the first time since my dad died, I felt safe, right? And so it was a place I ran to for the next 15 years. By the time I was 15, I got kicked out of the house. 16, I dropped out of school. And 17, I was involved in the criminal justice system. And I would have been one of those people you see, in downtown Honolulu or San Francisco or LA or Vancouver or Toronto pushing a shopping cart. I slept in parks. I collected cans and bottles to support an opioid dependency. For all intents and purposes, if you looked at me, I looked like a write-off. And I get that because I wasn't demonstrating to the world any of my potential. But here's the cool thing. I had people who supported me and loved me where I was at. I got a second chance. I went back to school. And in less than 12 years, I was a celebrated entrepreneur. So, one of the things I believe in is possibility. And I remember I was on a park bench once in just before I got off the street, there was a guy named Gus, an elder. And I remember he looked at me and he said, you know, Joe, he says, there's more to you than you can see. And at the time I was a dirty, disheveled, street person, but he spoke to my potential, what was just sort of behind that. And Gus was right. I got a second chance. I went into alcohol and drug treatment, back to college, graduated with honors, and then went into the business community. And the transferable skills from that really tough time in my life, I leveraged them in business. Oftentimes when we go through really tough stuff, whether it's our mental health or a challenging relationship, or, some challenges with our career or our finances, or, if we're going to school, we get on the other side and we now have tools that we harvested from that experience. So that's sort of the arc of the story. Part two was, interesting. I decided in 2003 to leave the business world. I wasn't having any fun anymore, and it wasn't really connected to my sense of purpose and passion. And so I left, and I decided I wanted to do a pay it forward project. So in 2016 and 17, I walked 9,000 kilometers, 5,625 miles across Canada, pushing a symbol of homelessness, a shopping cart. And I was a 49-year-old non-athlete. So today, what I'm trying to be every day as a father, as a community leader, is an example that despite what life throws at us, we're not defined by our past. Our future is spotless. And inside each and every one of us is something truly beautiful, special, and unique. But oftentimes that gets hard to see for ourselves and others sometimes.
Thanks for sharing that piece. It's an inspirational story for sure. Some of the questions that I have, though, are on the more of the difficult parts of the story, right? Because it's always nice to hear like, oh, I started off this way, I went down, but now I'm up. For me, I'm like, well, I'd like to know more on the parts that were down and what do you learn from that? Maybe some stories from that to give us, more context into how you get enough strength or momentum or support to move up.
I want to share with you and with folks watching and listening to this a model. So imagine in your mind there's three letters: the letter A, the letter I, and the letter R. And what those three letters represent is A is action, the things that we do. I is the inspiration, or what Simon Sinek calls the why, or the purpose or passion. And then R is the roadblock, the internal stuff in between our ears, and the external, the environment, politics, inflation, food prices, house prices. So for a lot of years, the R dominated my life. And what that R did is it distethered me from the I and the A. And so I think often what happens is that our world gets colored by negative life experience. Trauma is, a key example of that. It creates a narrative. My narrative was, I'm not worth it. I don't deserve this. I'm a piece of, So that roadblock, unchecked, will drive the action and the purpose or inspiration to change. For me, I was lucky enough. First of all, I didn't have the tools to solve this on my own. When you listen to the bio or you listen to the story, you're absolutely right, Evan. That story, it's this beautiful arc. It's like Rocky 1. It's like, oh yeah, I didn't do this. I had 1,000, 10,000 people helping and supporting me because the R's were so big in my life. So when I'm talking to people who are really stuck in the ditch, it's to try and surround them with people who can be like Gus, encourage them, because if we had the skill sets to unstuck ourselves, we would have done it by now. Because I still get stuck too. It's like, okay, great story. I'm still a human being today. I get depressed. I get distethered. I get anxious. The world today is an anxious place to live in. And so I count on people to help me navigate those roadblocks. So for a lot of years, if I can just speak to the I and the A, if you've got a story of being stuck, or you got a history of failure, or you got a background in trauma, or you got stories that you tell yourself, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not this enough, why would you take any action? You've already made your mind up. And there's some brain science behind why we do that. It's called the conservation of energy. And it's part of the fight or flight mechanism that when we are in crisis or dealing with challenge or change, we don't give energy to that which we deem non-essential, because we need that energy to fight or flight. This is why wellness is a difficult thing to embed into culture and embed into people. This is why health and fitness goals fail. It's not that we're weak. It's just that the mind says, I don't need that for survival. Why do it? Well, the same thing with somebody who's dealing with a roadblock. If I failed all my life, why would I go back to school? I'm dumb. So the actions aren't getting taken to discover our potential and possibility. And then that there is no impetus, there is no purpose, there is no greater reason why I ought to change. So when I'm looking at somebody, or if I'm coaching somebody, or if I'm being a dad, it's like, there's three things I want to know. Are you stuck? Are you distethered? There's no motivation. Or do you just not know what to do next? Is it action? Is it inspiration? Is it roadblock? And then manage those three levers. And you can take somebody and help them get 30 days sober, or you can help somebody write their first book, or you can teach somebody how to walk across the second widest country on earth.
So do you have a story that can demonstrate that?
Yeah, so the push for change is the greatest example of that. When I embarked on the idea of walking across Canada, I was a 45-year-old non-athlete. I failed grade 9 and grade 10 gym. I did not see myself as a sporty person. I didn't do sports. Sports wasn't my thing. I was the class clown. I was that was me. So when I initially approached that, the idea of walking 9,000 kilometers over 17 months through a Canadian winter naturally scared me, right? The roadblocks were, I'm too old, I'm not an athlete, I'm going to hurt myself, I have no business doing this, right? There were 10,000 good reasons why I shouldn't do this. But the I is what then drove the action. So the I was, but I want to help young people who are struggling, young people who have all the possibility, but they come from impossible environments. Kids that are born into single parent families, kids that, don't identify into, a gender category, kids that are struggling with, substance use disorder, early childhood trauma, right? And so I said, I want because I believe that every young person deserves to grow up and become their potential. So that became the why. Then it became, okay, what do I got to do next? Now, when you're taking something on that big, there's lots of different things that you can do. But if the roadblock gets big, so if the R gets big, the A goes down, and then you drop out of I. So that's my example, the push for change, and I could talk to that for hours. But here's a great example that most people can identify who have ever tried or failed at a fitness goal, right? They've said, January 1st, I'm going to start jogging, I'm going to quit smoking, I'm going to lose 30 pounds, I'm going to eat better, I'm going to join a gym. So they take some actions, and they're intensely positive and energetic in the beginning. So they're out there, they're running on day 1, day 2, January 4, January 5. They've got some friends, things are going, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, January 14th or February 3rd hits and they eat some cake and they don't go to the gym. And then the internal roadblocks, you're a failure. You're always going to fail. This fitness isn't your thing. You're not suited to lose weight. And then they get out of action. So the entire thing collapses. When I'm looking at this, I want to know if, let's say you want to create this possibility in your life, this possibility A. I want to know, my first question is why? Because if you don't have really good reasons for it, the roadblocks are coming. Because commitment is the willingness to carry through with a decision long after the mood in which it was created is gone. So we get excited about something, but invariably that excitement and energy wanes. Now, if we don't have a really good driving purpose, what will always happen is action will drop off. And that's not us. That's how our brains are designed. Now, the greatest thing that we do that gets us into trouble is that when we do that and go through that process, and it's the most normal and natural thing in the world for a human being to fall out of action, because of that fight or flight conservation of energy mechanism, we then beat ourselves up. And then we fortify our internal story that I'm not worth it, I'm no good, I always fail, blah, 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 blah. So my negative story of life circumstances was that. Now, Dr. Carol Dweck, she's a famous Stanford researcher. She wrote a book on growth versus fixed mindset. They actually studied this in the lab with kids. And they gave these kids unsolvable puzzles. And there were two kinds of reactions. The kids who thought that they didn't have the skill to solve the puzzle gave up really quick. They hit a roadblock and they stopped taking action. And they just thought to themselves, well, I'm not smart enough to do this. And so we call that a fixed mindset. There was another group of kids, and they looked at it and said, oh, this is exciting. If I continue, I'm going to figure out how to do this. And those kids were categorized as growth mindset. Now, here's the thing. This is how life works. You can't discover your possibility and potential unless you take action. It's only in taking action that you discover your possibility and potential. My daughter said to me at 13, I'm no good at soccer. And I said, you've played it twice. You do not have enough evidence to prove to me that you're not good at this. Look, if you don't like it, no problem. And if you don't want to continue, that's cool too. But don't try to sell me on the fact that you're no good at this. You simply haven't tried. Here's another example too. Is like how many people you meet and they say, oh, I'm just not good at public speaking. Right, because in grade 2, you stood up in front of the class, you got laughed at. You felt humiliated and you said, I'm not a speaker, and never tried it again. And wrote a story in your head that says, I'm not a good public speaker. You're probably not a good juggler either, but you don't have a story about that, right? You're not a good juggler because you didn't practice. You're not a good speaker because you didn't practice, but if you practiced at it, right? So in Carol Dweck's research, she actually showed in a clinical setting that when we take action, we can overcome those roadblocks and discover our possibility and potential. Now she teaches that in school curriculums all over the world. And the cool thing about that idea is it's a doorway to equality. It doesn't matter who you are. If you can connect to some action, find some good reasons to stay in action, you can overcome any situational and psychological roadblock to create whatever possibility you want with your time on this planet.
You know, when you mentioned you didn't have enough time or you didn't have the resources or so on to process properly when you were young, what do you mean by process properly, and what does that look like? How do people do it?
For me, probably the most meaningful work I've done is with a practitioner and with other people. You can gain a lot from meditation and learning and journaling. And those are, I think, are incredibly valuable tools. But to me, those are tools that need to be augmented with the deeper work. I think all of us have blind sides. And I've worked with people in the recovery community. I've worked with people in spiritual community. And I've worked with professional psychologists and clinicians. And they've helped me pull back and get a perspective. And most of the time it comes down to this: Joe, that story or that thing that happened doesn't really mean that. And you get to reauthor the most horrendous things that happen in our life. There are 4 stages, and I know you know this. You know, it's like oftentimes stuff happens and we immediately make up a story about it. Daniel Kahneman, in his famous book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, talks about the system 1 brain and the system 2 brain. A lot of times the most horrendous things that happen in our life, we make meaning up in that system 1 brain. We have to, because our brain is designed to keep us alive. It's not designed for high performance. It's designed to keep us alive. So when something happens we don't understand it, we label it as such. If we don't ever go back and look at that stuff through a different perspective, we're trapped with that narrative for the rest of our lives. So for me, the greatest work has been going back and looking at those stories, like when my stepfather, beat me. That wasn't me. He probably was raised with that. He was an insecure individual who struggled with substance use disorder, and hurt people. So it's not that I was a bad kid. And then it's like, okay, well then who was his dad? And who was his dad? And you start to get into it, and all of a sudden you give yourself a bit of a break and you go, wow, accept the humanness of that experience. But after acceptance, moving through and re-narrating it. I would have never wanted to wish homelessness and substance use and despair on anybody in the world. But today it's my greatest asset. And I've spoken to over, 2 million young people. So I've taken most of the stuff that happened back then and leveraged it today. But a lot of times to do that stuff, I think you need to not go into that alone. You go into the brain, you go into the past with a friend and a flashlight, and you poke it into every single corner if you've got the courage to do that, and you bring those things out. And oftentimes there's a good cry and there's an outpouring of emotion. Sometimes there isn't.
So is that done with a practitioner or a therapist? Was it more important in a group, or was that with your friend?
I think it's all the above. I had a conversation with 2 friends today. One's a mental health advocate and one's a person in long-term recovery. And I gained something from both of those conversations. But some of the deeper trauma work I've done with a psychologist. For me, there's 32 years of this stuff that I've been sort of chomping and chewing. And today I have insight. Today I have a pretty good look at who I am. Here's an example. I didn't know this till 10 years ago. I'm incredibly independent. I live in the illusion of self-sufficiency. Right? What that means is that I'm too proud to ask for help. And I said it when I was in Honolulu. The heaviest thing I ever lifted in my life was my hand for help, right? Why is that? Why are some people like fiercely independent? I'll tell you why I am. Because when I was a kid, nobody came to save me. I felt alone and abandoned. And the people who were entrusted with the responsibility of caring for me ignored my cries for help. And so I learned after a while to just keep my mouth shut. That's kind of sad, isn't it? But today, when I'm afraid or I'm feeling hurt, I try to reach out. And I don't feel like I'm ever done. I don't think the process is ever done. I'm constantly discovering, new stuff. In the first 5 years, there was a lot of skeletons to clear out. And now it's just trying to tweak process and go, I did that. That wasn't very productive. Why? And I become sort of empathically curious. I also with other people's behavior too, it's given me a lot of maybe more patience and tolerance because I always ask the question, what happened before that happened? When people were losing their minds during COVID and grocery stores and in public, people were just screaming at each other. What I saw is a bunch of scared people and they were hurt and they were afraid. It doesn't help. Sometimes you're still impacted by that negative behavior, but that's helped me as a father and as a leader to just sort of be a little bit more empathic and not so quick to judge.
How many kids do you have?
So I have a daughter, an adult daughter who's in her 3rd year. And then I share 2 wonderful adult children with my wife, Marie. So we have a sort of a blended family, but they're all grown up.
What's the most important thing that you learned from your experiences that have helped you in your parenting and how have you applied that?
One of the things that I've always tried to drill into my daughter is that we live in an effort-based world. And, I've always been a little afraid because as someone who struggled with substance abuse, and I was afraid that, it's in her genes and, my daughter's, statistically, she's at a higher risk. Like, that's what we know. We can't quite put the finger on what that means. Is it a gene? Is it nurture, nature? We don't know. But we statistically know that children born to a parent or parents who have struggled with substance use disorder are more likely to. So I was always afraid of that. But the thing I want for my daughter is for her to get close to self-actualization as possible. So love, support, no matter what you do, I'm in your corner, of course. But what I've tried to do is instill in her the fearlessness and the courage to take action in the face of negative emotion. If you say to her, Lauren is her name, Lauren, what kind of world do we live in? She'll roll her eyes and she'll go, we live in an effort-based world, Dad. Because what I wanted her to understand is that, for the first 24 years of my life, I had a story in my head that prevented me from taking any steps forward. I had already made my mind up I was dumb. I'd already made my mind up there wasn't anything good in life for me, so why bother trying? And what I understand today is that all possibility requires to show itself in life and in the world around us is for someone to move it forward, to take some action. Every single piece of invention or technology that we enjoy today in our modern world didn't exist 200 years ago. 200 years ago, there was no electricity in our homes, and now you can book a flight on Richard Branson's shuttle into space. We've got satellites on, we got rovers on Mars. We've got advancement in telecommunications. You can fly from my house to Honolulu in 5.5 hours. None of that existed 200 years ago. How did those come about? Somebody took some action, believing in a possibility, and brought that out of the realm of whatever is before invention into reality. Well, the same holds true for us. The skills that you have today, the empathy that you have as a healer, as a counselor, the heart that you have for wanting to help and do this program, that didn't just sort of happen by osmosis or by accident. Sorry, that was a long answer. Teaching her that she's absolutely brilliant and to be fearless, taking steps forward, because in those steps forward, she'll discover her greater sense of self.
And then how do you do that? Like, what are the actual steps or actions to do that?
Well, again, let's go back to that AIR model because I think and live through that. So go back to the soccer example. It's like, okay, there's three things to look at. It's like, is she not taking the action necessary? Is she not motivated to take the action? Is it a purpose or a passion? Or is there a roadblock? And what is that roadblock? Is it internal or is it external? Maybe she's being bullied. Okay, that makes sense. Let's get you out of that environment. Soccer's not your thing, and that team, maybe we take you across town. So anytime I'm trying to coach or parent, I'm thinking through the model. It's like, okay, if I want you to clean your room, right? So I want to try and find something that's going to inspire you to take the action. So, we talk a lot about kids being disengaged. Kids today are just not, that's nonsense. I'm sorry, but I walked across Canada and I encountered 100,000 kids who were not disengaged. They were fully engaged because they had something to connect to. They're like, wow, I love this. And they were doing car washes, writing songs, marching down the road, collecting money, selling cupcakes, doing penny drives, like you name it. They were inspired to take action. So if it's somebody in early recovery or, one of the kids, that's what I'm looking at from a coach perspective. It's like, okay, what is it? Is it that you're out of action? You're out of integrity? Like, if that's the case, just put your shoes on and encourage the next set of actions and then report back. That you don't care or you're just tethered from this. Like you just, I don't care whether I achieve this or I don't achieve that. Okay, that makes sense. I'm fine with I don't care. Let's move on to something you do. But if it's a roadblock, then I'm going to say, okay, is it an external roadblock or is this an internal narrative? Is this something deeper? And so I kind of go through those because the AIR model is dynamic. The health example for New Year's resolution, when you start, you're really inspired. This is going to be my year. Yeah. And you get up and you do that first run on January 1st and you're out there and you're inspired. You're thinking about the Honolulu Marathon and the way you go and, you finish and everything's great. And the next day and the next day, everything's great. So you're inspired and you're taking action, inspired taking actions, and the roadblocks are low. But then you wake up one day and you're unmotivated. You got a sore hip or knee. You don't do your run that day. And then that night you eat pizza. And the next day you don't do a run. The next day you don't do a run. And all of a sudden you're like, it's just like every other year. So that's where I say, is it really important for you to continue? What's your reasons for doing this? And so it's really just sort of managing one of those three pieces. Is it a roadblock issue? Is it a purpose issue, passion, inspiration? Or is it you just need to crack the whip and put the shoes on and go do something?
Do you have a spiritual practice?
It's eclectic. Yeah, I do. But it's hard to put in a box. I believe that the Spirit shines through us. And I'm carefully using words because words can then box things in. You say Holy Spirit. Okay, we're in this camp. If we say Great Spirit, we're in this camp. If we say universe, maybe we're talking about that thing. So I'm careful because language is important. What I do know is that, every single human being shines a light. Some people, their light is dimmer, but it's there. And I do believe that sort of we're here for the service of others. We talk about what is the meaning of life. I think it's just change the I to O, and that's it. It's to love ourselves completely. And when we do that, then we can shine that for others. I don't know about anything other than now, though. I don't project. I don't know. I don't transcend. I'm careful of sort of going into that. And I guess this is a belief, is that I think that's just getting into story time. And what I do know about the human experience is that every single day we're alive, we are a creature that knows that one day we will meet our demise. And our brain doesn't like that. So we create lots and lots and lots of story around that. I think that from a spiritual practice, the best thing I can do is to not hurt myself today and try and do my best to lighten somebody else's load. Yeah, if I can do that, then it's a good day. And sometimes it's just something small, like engaging somebody at Starbucks or, chatting someone up.
Have you ever had in the last, I don't know, number of years, a serious relapse or a period where you went really down? And then if so, like, how do you get back out of that?
Yeah, I did. So I came in I got sober in 1991, and I was one of those people who went without relapse for 12 years in a row. So some people's path is lots of relapse and then it sticks. Some people, they're in and out of recovery for 30 years and they never put more than a couple of years together. I don't judge because I don't know what roadblock somebody's dealing with. But for me, I had 12 years and 5 days clean. And I was really successful. And then I had a elective surgery and they gave me a kind of drug that I shouldn't have been given. And my accountability was not good. And so I abused this prescription, which led me eventually back. It took months, but eventually back to, when I relapsed after 12 years, I didn't end up back pushing a shopping cart because now I had money and resources. So the relapse didn't look like homelessness, but it got bad, and I destroyed my reputation. I did a lot of damage. Now, I just celebrated 17 years again, but I relapsed for about 3 years. And again, it wasn't me. I was dealing with the pain of the consequences of my life and wanted that to stop. But at the same time, I wasn't willing to commit back into recovery. So that's why I struggled for 3 years until finally I surrendered back into the process. And, I remember I walked back into the same place that I'd used to attend recovery. And I learned that all the shame associated with that relapse, because I had a lot of shame, is that, I treated my recovery like an asset. The amount of clean time I had mattered a lot to me. Yet the people who loved me most couldn't care less. They just didn't want to see me die. And so, they surrounded me again, and I went through those early months and years. But the interesting thing about relapse and recovery after many, many years is that it didn't take me long to get traction again. And it didn't take me 5-7 years. I got right back into it right away, and off I went. And that experience for me taught me that recovery, substance use disorder, or if we want to call it addiction, I know we're changing language all the time, but addiction to me, I'm an old school guy, is the kind of thing that you fall asleep and you think you're awake. That's the way I could describe it, is this thing that you got that's dormant and can be for years, but if you take your eye off of it, it will come back into your life. There is no recovered. I don't have the issues I had before. And this is just me. I don't feel I can safely consume mood-altering substances in any form. And that's just me. I have friends of mine who, they're not recovery community people. They're first responders and they use psychedelic. Fine, cool. I've learned that, no judgment. Whatever people are doing to get through their day, God bless you. But yeah, I think the biggest piece for me on that relapse was the shame associated with it. And how the only person who cared about my clean time was me. And when I finally got back into that group, things started to move forward again. I'm a lot more vigilant today. I know that I'm one use away from potentially destroying everything that I spent the last 17 years building. So
Was the shame that you were feeling shame from relapsing, or was it the shame that was coming up from previous that was not necessarily healed?
Both. And what's interesting is when I got into the deeper work, I thought it was, I'm ashamed of my relapse. And it's like, no, because I went in there with a friend of mine who's a psychologist, and we went, okay, yeah, there's that, but what else is there? And we kind of, went around there, and there was unresolved stuff that I hadn't worked through in those first 12 years. I got sober. I went to school. I went out in business. And I started using, accomplishment and all that stuff to mask the unresolved stuff that was really the root cause of why I looked to medicate and alter my state. So in many ways, I'm grateful that relapse happened, although I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, because it forced me to take a look at, wait a second, there's a lot of unresolved stuff. Once I got past the initial sting, a couple years of relapsing and coming back. Yeah, it was that deeper stuff that happened when I was a kid. The feeling of no matter what, I'm not good enough, or I'm not worthy of love from these people, or.
What was the primary lesson that you needed and need to learn that kind of wove through all of those experiences?
I think it's two things that when we go through the storm, a lot of times we blame ourselves. But when I look back on it now, like if it's Big Joe talking to Little Joe, it's like, hey, dude, you're doing the best you could with what you had. And it wasn't you, it was them, or it was this, or it's not what you, like, I get that you think that would make total sense. But what if it was this? And so it gave me a tool to be able to look at some of the toughest stuff in my life with a different perspective. I'm able to use that now and also see patterns in other people. It's like, oh, and then you just ask an empathic question. I get that you see that, but what if it was this? And I'll tell you the experience of that, it's like a burden gets lifted because you've carried that crap your whole life. And then you realize it was an illusion the entire time. This is whatever you made up. And the brain and the way we make up stories and narratives about our stuff is so fickle. You take a great kid from a great home. Dad says something and a screen door slams. And now every time a screen door slams, you get anxious. And it's just like, it's so wild the way our brains work and how we can log these random things and connect them to these thematic visions that we have of who we are. And at the end of the day, that's actually not a reflection of who you are. That's just the meaning you made. And you can go back and you can change that meaning anytime.
When you go back and change that meaning, what's the steps to do that?
Well, it's been different kinds of processes for me. Sometimes it's been written work, going through, a question. Okay, you were here. What did you think? What was that experience? How did you think? How did you feel? How do you think about it now? So there's been that. When I've done different kinds of like regressive therapy, it's, okay, where were you? How old were you? But I wouldn't recommend somebody do that on their own because
That would be hard.
you don't, yeah, I used the term before, you want to go in there with a friend and a flashlight because sometimes I see stuff like this being done in personal development rooms with unqualified people. And it frightens me a little bit because you can actually do more. You can further drive somebody into a hole unknowingly. So for me, the deep work, and I say this when I do workshops, if big stuff comes up for you, hit pause and reach out to someone, reach out to your mental health support network, talk to somebody professional who can guide you through some of the big stuff. When you're talking about grief, early childhood trauma, physical violence, sexual violence, like that's not something I would ever navigate somebody through. My best would be, wow, that's really a lot. And I do not feel qualified. I've been through some things, but, and I would guide them towards someone like Sean or someone like yourself to process that. Self-help books, journaling, that kind of stuff. These are good things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the bigger, deeper stuff, I think you need to have an emotional Sherpa to walk you through because a lot of times there's a release.
I think you got to definitely have a practitioner that knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And has done their own work.
Yeah, true
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Because if the practitioner hasn't done their own work, they get triggered. Doesn't work. You can't hold the space.
Yeah. We were just down in California in San Diego, and we spent 2 days with this wonderful woman. She reminds me of an old hippie from Northern California mountains, and she held this beautiful space for us for 2 days, and you could tell, like I can tell. Yeah. One, she's been there, but two, she's free of it. And she was able to sort of, yeah.
I was going to ask if you know what therapeutic models were used that were most effective for you, or what healing models were used.
I couldn't with any accuracy say I could walk through the process, and I would probably want to say it was regressive stuff, but I don't know. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't privy to or even curious about what that was. When I'm doing work, I want to, one, trust the person. And maybe it's because I'm not that analytical, so I'm not really sort of looking at the process. I'm sort of open. But to me, what's really key and what I have a high radar for is bullshit. And so if I'm working with someone and they kind of, there's a little bit of inauthenticity, I clamshell real quick just because I don't feel safe. I remember a couple of years ago, we were up in the mountains with this guy and it wasn't right. And some of the language sounded great and the exercise looked really kind of, yeah, it was well put together. But I just went, and I found myself really, really holding back. So the process is, what works for me is more, do I trust this person? People. The recovery community I trust to a certain degree. There's certain people I have more breadth with as opposed to just sort of being in a public room. Things you share there, things you share here are different. And then I have friends like that have some of your background and skill set and training who I will then say, hey, could we do, this or that? And then we'll set time aside and get into it.
I mean, that makes sense because the healing process only moves at the speed of trust. If there's no trust in the container and the relationship is not there, there is no space to do anything healing wise. So what you said made total sense to me.
Well, yeah, but there can also be an illusion of we're doing something, because today more than ever, I think people are hungry for spiritual answers and for healing. And so they're easily tricked into thinking they went through an authentic experience and it was just, So
Yeah.
one of the things, like I spent 10 years in a really unsafe environment. And I'm not talking about growing up, but when I was out in the street spinning for prizes, one of the things that you hone is a bit of a radar. And Malcolm Gladwell talks about this in his book, Blink. You have a skill set. You don't quite know how to explain it to people. And my Blink skill set is that I can read a room. So when I was out there, and I don't know what it is I've never been formally taught this, but I can tell if your energy is good. And the reason I have such a high radar for that is my life depended on this in some circumstances. It's 3:00 in the morning. You're out in the dark, face to face with people. You better be able to pick up on what is, So what was cool was when I got into recovery, I went into boardrooms and I was in sales environments or I was teaching or training. I immediately knew who was there, who wasn't. And it had nothing to do with how they were physically presenting. It just had to do with something else. But I use that today in that journey or recovery journey or healing process. And it has served me really well. In fact, I think I saw something on LinkedIn that I think it was Samuel L. Jackson talked about, being able to sort of pick up on someone's energy. No, it was Shawshank Redemption. What's the fellow's name?
Morgan Freeman.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. It was actually this morning I was scrolling through and I saw that. And it's like, trust your gut was the core of the message. And, again, I feel blessed with that. And I think the more internal work you do, the better you know you. And the better you know you, the quicker you can sort of pick up on the charlatans and the folks who maybe they're not charlatans. Maybe they're just, like you said, they haven't done their own internal stuff.
So kind of with that being said, I'm curious then, we just met today for the most part. What's your initial read on me? And you can be fully, totally honest. I'm just curious. Don't worry about hurting my feelings either.
No. I think you're a deep thinker. I think there's a lot more going on with you than the world sees. I think that you see a lot of detail. I think you pay attention to a lot more of the small stuff and the nuanced stuff. And I think that probably makes you really, really good at what you do. I think to be a good healer, you need to sort of have that third eye. And I think that you have that. I can tell you this, you and I wouldn't be on the call if I thought you were trying to do something for self-promotion. So the thing I like about Greater Good Radio is that you're trying to do something to help Sherpa other people. And maybe this is part of your journey. I don't know. I know it was like herding cats trying to get us to this time together. But yeah, I think that if you're somebody that if we lived close, we would probably have a coffee. And I don't have a lot of coffees, but I think there's a lot more to you than the world sees. I think there's a deliberate humility there.
To me, in my own personal opinion, it feels 100% accurate. And I appreciate that. I want to send you some appreciation. It makes me definitely feel seen and heard and validated for sure.
I think that the thing that I haven't run a company and the foundation is you look for people who have offsetting skill sets. And I'm not a detailed person. Maria is. I make spelling mistakes. Part of it's dyslexia, part of it's impatience. When I'm around people, I think they have a broader scope of stuff than I do. I dig them because I don't. I can be really myopic because I have to make decisions and do that thing. And so I like those people around me. Sean is one of those people. You know, I'll have a conversation. He'll be like, stop. Exactly what did you just say? Because he's listening to words. And I'm just spitting and yeah. So there's, for a lot of years in my life, I was threatened by anything that didn't look like me. And now it's like I understand that diversity and different people, they just bring a color to my life that's so cool. And sometimes it's hanging out with someone who's some ways your opposites or can complement. And I think you remind me in some ways like my partner and wife, Marie. Yeah.
That's a compliment.
Yeah, it is.
It's a compliment. I was sitting right next to her at the conference and I heard you speak about her, and her energy is really, really sweet and loving. And she's on
don't
it
be
because she
fooled.
was the one who was coordinating.
Yeah. Sorry, don't be fooled though. One thing I like about her is she'll call me on my stuff too, because she sees.
Doesn't mean it's not loving.
Oh no, it's totally
Yeah.
loving. But the detail that she sees the world in, and it's just like, oh wow, it gives me a perspective that I can't get to on my own.
So what is one thing that you may not have ever told Marie, but you would like to? You just haven't been able to do it, maybe for one reason or another.
I have to say, and I'll think about this later maybe, and I'll change my answer, but I've really tried to be as transparent and open in this relationship. It's my second marriage. So from the beginning, the message is there's more in you than you can see. And it's a resonating message that I share with different people. It's the same kind of message, but it comes through in different ways for different folks. And I feel like I haven't left anything unsaid. And what I try to do, though, is come back to that again and again. When I see that it's not being heard, let's say here or here, I'll try to remind her of how extraordinary she is. Because we don't see it. If you ask 10 people, who are you, you'd get 10 responses. And they're flattering because people love you. But that's not how we see ourselves. And the thing that I've not left unsaid with her is the thing I don't want to leave unsaid on this planet, because the same holds for her as for any human being, that we are so extraordinary beyond anything and any label or any box we put ourselves in. We're so much more than the things we've been told, the things we've witnessed, and the narratives we tell ourselves. That beyond that, we are love, we're light, we're beauty. And when we connect to that, and let that shine through, that's when I think I'm most beautiful. And I think one of the ways it comes out the quickest is when we're in the service of others.
What's the most core need that gets filled for you by Marie being in your life?
The core need?
Yeah, your most core need, core need like love, acceptance, self-worth, autonomy, the most core need that you have gets filled because she's in your life.
Sort of a combination of companionship, love, friendship, and purpose. Because together we work, together we co-parent, together we travel. And my entire life I was lonely and just hoping and wishing that I could find that one person to, and as a hopeless romantic, Marie really is. You know the story. Dated in high school, lost contact. 28 years later, we reconnect. And it's one of these, it's almost like an Oscar movie ending. And not to sound trite, but, we are those soulmates and we kind of complete each other. We are such a perfect fit for life, love, and work. And that's an incredibly rare thing when you can find somebody and you can stand sitting beside them for an hour and not saying anything in the same room. That's something really special. But as for unsaid, I don't know. I think it's complex. It's not one,
Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to cover?
No, I think we're good. I mean, I shared that story when I was on that park bench, when I was dealing with hopelessness. And Gus said to me, there's more to you than you can see. And I think that we live in a world right now where maybe people aren't necessarily homeless, but they're struggling. They're struggling with making ends meet, maybe they're struggling with their relationships. They're struggling trying to find meaning in a world that seems to be going sideways fast. What I know is that I've been in, at the bottom of catastrophic failure and hurt, and there's something on the other side of that. And that what Gus said is as true for me as it is for any human being, that there's more to us than we can see. But sometimes we can spend our whole life and not find that because we never get off that park bench and take a few steps forward. A therapist, a healer, a recovery community is only as good as the participation that you give it. And ultimately, you got to put your shoes on, you got to lace up, and you got to take a couple of courageous steps forward in negative emotion. And when we do that, the skies part, the rainbow comes out, and it's a new day. And we see that thing. The other thing is Gus spent 10 minutes with me, 35 years ago. If there's one thing I want, when I'm all used up and I've moved on to the next dimension, that's what I want people to remember, is that I championed that one idea, and to get people to get that.
Well, I want to acknowledge you, Joe Roberts. Your work is inspirational. Your journey has been motivating, and I appreciate that you could have just stuck with business and made money, although you followed kind of your calling to make a difference in the world for others. So thank you for your time. I know you have some family obligations, and I appreciate you making the time and spending it with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. I appreciate it. And thanks for the platform and all the good work you're doing as well.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Cheers.
All right. If you resonate with Greater Good Radio, please join our community at www.greatergoodradio.com, where you can get access to exclusive content and offerings. Hope to see you soon.